Dr. Peterson is the last speaker of the FAIR conference, and also following tradition, we still do not know the title of his presentation today. Not following tradition, I asked him if it would be all right if I didn't do a typical introduction, and he said as long as I wasn't too insulting, and I said that I could only promise to meet that partway. For Dr. Peterson's official bio, we'd like to refer you to the program, and there's an extensive biography in there about all of the wonderful things he's been working on. But I would like to share something that some of you may not know about Dr. Peterson, and a lot of you will know, the ones that frequent the message boards. But Dr. Peterson is actually dishonest and mean. And dishonest and mean and ugly.
Yeah.
He has horns, but he's retracted them today. I think that covers it if we use broad adjectives there. And seriously, there are some people that really think this about him. And I know Dr. Peterson quite differently. I don't know him well, but I know his internet persona. I am a convert of just a little over 3 years, and my investigation, I'm a product of FAIR. I found FAIR during my investigation. I had 2 born-again Christian friends who were very concerned about my investigation into Mormonism and shared all sorts of lovely materials with me, some of which are out on the table, And I have a tape from a physician, and I have an Ed Decker thing, and I found the FAIR message board, and through there, I found the FAIR website, which answered a lot of questions, and through that I found another message board where there was a lot of active, faithful, intelligent, rational, reasonable, analytical Latter-day Saints discussing things. And I started, I mostly just lurked there, but I did start braving things and asked a couple questions, and it was under a pseudonym, and no one knew me. I just came out of nowhere, so they didn't know if I was Mormon or anti-Mormon or whatever. The very first person to answer my question was the first question I posted was John Tibetnez. Dan Peterson was one of the second people that answered a question of mine, and Kevin Barney was one of the initial people too. And that meant the world to me, and that information they provided to me was immensely helpful and played a part during my investigation. As Dr. Keller stated, only the Holy Ghost converts, and luckily I had one of those powerful spiritual manifestations also. But my mind was open to it partly because of the role that FAIR plays and that scholars and apologists play in defending our faith. And with that, I would like to thank Dr. Peterson for his role in that and introduce him as our final concluding speaker.
I'm really delighted to have the acoustic. Some of you may know that there was a cartoon done of me in Sunstone recently, a very flattering article about me. Danable Lecter, right? I contacted Dan Witherspoon about that and wanted to know if I could get the original for framing. This will probably have to take the place because he told me Sunstone didn't own the rights and I'd have to buy it from the artist, and I'm not sure I like it that much. But what I've decided to do, and I can understand why people think there's a kind of echo up here. It does sound like it, but I guess there isn't, right? I mean, it's clear to you out there. Okay. What I thought I'd do today, and it strikes me as in some ways an awfully brittle and shallow thing to do after this last presentation, which I regard as really in many ways very, very moving, is to offer, and I always have doubts about what I'm about to do when I start to do it, but I thought I'd offer a kind of what might come across as a kind of intellectual historical testimony, a kind of autobiography, a kind of overview of farms with which I've been involved for quite a long time, and just make some observations along the way in a kind of narrative fashion. And you can see this as a kind of testimony. A testimony of someone who's been involved on a kind of intellectual and academic level with Mormonism for quite some time, and who still finds it incredibly interesting. stimulating and even liberating and exhilarating. I was born and raised in Southern California. I was raised in a part-member family. My father was a non-member, my mother a partially active member. I can remember that my first serious thoughts about religious topics were essentially agnostic. I did not see anything particularly convincing about the church that I was occasionally taken to, the LDS Church, or any other. It didn't strike me as very interesting. In fact, what I can mostly remember about church was that it seemed to me a virtually interminable series of incredibly boring meetings, which is not an attitude I've changed altogether. And I realize that may be a reflection on my spiritual state, but nonetheless, that's there, that's a fact. I was kind of maybe an exhibitionistically precocious kid at some points. I can remember reading Dante and Bertrand Russell and Nietzsche and so on at very young ages, probably not understanding much. My father owned a construction business. I grew up in a pretty working class family, and so I made a point of reading Karl Marx at lunchtime. It seemed the thing to do. I was a member of the working class, why not read Marx? It was interesting to me that none of the people around me found it even slightly interesting. The real working class didn't seem to care about Karl Marx. They were all busy planning their weekend adventures in their campers and motorhomes. But I can remember, too, feeling at a very young age a kind of inchoate yearning for something a little better than what I could sense in the world around me. And this maybe is at the base of my eventual interest in the gospel, even despite what I saw as the obstacle of the church in those days. And it expressed itself to me in a number of ways. For one thing, there were certain landscapes that seemed to me just to point to something beyond themselves. It's hard to explain what this is like. Maybe some of you have sensed it. There are certain landscapes that really speak to me. I just came back last week from a trip to Europe. I've been traveling an awful lot the last 3 months. And if I fall asleep up here, I apologize. I've been, more out of the country than in. And I'm not sure what time zone I'm in right now. But for me, one of the places that I deliberately spent time in, is an area called the Berner Oberland in the Swiss Alps. That's where I served my mission, and I still regard it as the most beautiful place on the face of the earth. This landscape to me is just unbelievably beautiful. Nevertheless, there's something about it that doesn't satisfy. It's sort of like Thomas Henry Huxley, who after a performance of Hamlet is supposed to have said, that was an absolutely brilliant performance. But then the next thought was, but is that really all there is? That somehow even something as good as that didn't quite satisfy. And to me, these landscapes, I could name some others. There's a place in the Italian Alps that really gets me, the Canadian Rockies. For me, it's mountains, alpine scenery. There's a sense in which I think, I would like to possess them in a way that simply owning them would never do. That is, there's something, I realize I'm just a passer through. And that there's some place, C.S. Lewis talked about it as the yearning for pure northernness. Have you ever read his autobiography, Surprised by Joy? Where he said there were certain landscapes, for him that they were evoked by the music of Wagner. Wagner can do that to me too, even though I realize he was a swine and a sort of proto-Nazi. Occasionally his music, or there's one chord in Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor. It just seemed to me to suggest something beyond themselves. Something that you want to get to. And to me, as for C.S. Lewis, what this is really talking about is a yearning that can't be satisfied by anything in this life. That the best things in this life, the best art, the best music, the best landscapes, the most beautiful places, don't quite do it. That we were created for something else. A great line from St. Augustine, opening passage of his Confessions, where he says, Our hearts are restless until they rest in Thee, addressing God. And I think that's absolutely right. It certainly has been true for me, that there's nothing in this world that quite satisfies. I've been bothered by an acute sense of transience since I can remember. I look at flowers, and I find them more depressing than anything else, because I know they won't last. I spend a lot of my career looking at crumbling documents and the ruins of buildings, and can't help but think that the people who built them and who thought they were so wonderful have been gone for a long, long time. And it's as if almost they had never lived. That sense that we pass and that we're not really at home here, to borrow the cliched old line from the sort of country spiritual, we're pilgrims and strangers, is really acutely true for me.